I never thought providing internet to my neighbors would turn into the biggest nightmare of my life. But that was before I met Brenda from the HOA. My name is Yuri Daniels, and I'm a network engineer who works remotely from my house in Henderson, Nevada, a suburb just outside Las Vegas. When I moved into the Sunset Ridge community 3 years ago, I quickly discovered that the only internet provider willing to service our area was charging absolutely ridiculous rates. We're talking $300 a month for speeds that barely hit 50 megabits per second. The community had about 40 homes, and most of my neighbors were either retired folks on fixed incomes or young families trying to make ends meet. Being a network engineer, I saw an opportunity to help everyone out while also solving my own internet problem. I contacted a business fiber provider, got a dedicated line installed with symmetrical gigabit speeds for about $800 a month, and set up a proper network infrastructure to share it with the neighborhood. I charged each household $50 a month, which more than covered my costs and gave everyone blazing fast internet at a sixth of what they'd been paying before. Everyone was thrilled, and for 3 years, everything ran smoothly. Then the old HOA board members retired and moved away, and new blood took over. That's when Brenda Patterson entered my life like a hurricane made of entitlement and bad highlights. It was a Tuesday morning in March when she first knocked on my door. I was in the middle of a video conference with my team in California, so I ignored it. She knocked again, harder this time, and I heard her shrill voice through the door. "I know you're in there. Your car is in the driveway." I muted my microphone and went to the door, opening it to find a woman in her early 50s wearing a white visor, a pink polo shirt, and an expression that suggested she'd been sucking on lemons all morning. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to keep the irritation out of my voice. "I'm Brenda Patterson, the new HOA president," she announced, as if I should drop everything and roll out a red carpet. "We need to discuss your little internet operation." "I'm actually in the middle of a work meeting," I said. "Can this wait?" "No, it cannot wait. This is HOA business, and as a resident of Sunset Ridge, you're required to make yourself available when the board needs to speak with you." That wasn't true at all, but I didn't have time to argue. "I'll come by the HOA office this evening at 6. Will that work?" She pursed her lips like she'd tasted something bitter. "Fine. Don't be late." She spun on her heel and marched back to her golf cart, which she'd parked directly behind my car, blocking me in. I closed the door and returned to my meeting, already feeling a headache forming behind my eyes. That evening, I walked over to the HOA office, which was really just a converted garage in one of the community buildings. Brenda sat behind a folding table she'd apparently designated as her desk, flanked by 2 other board members I'd never met before. A man in his 60s with a comb-over sat to her left, and a woman who looked to be in her 40s with severe bangs sat to her right. "Mr. Daniels, thank you for finally joining us," Brenda said, gesturing to a folding chair positioned in front of the table like I was about to be interrogated. "This is Gerald Tompkins, our treasurer, and Susan Whitmore, our secretary." I nodded at them both and sat down. "What's this about?" Brenda folded her hands on the table. "It's come to our attention that you're running an unauthorized business operation out of your residence, which violates Section 12, Paragraph 4 of our HOA bylaws." I pulled out my phone and opened the digital copy of the bylaws I kept handy. Section 12, Paragraph 4 states that residents cannot operate businesses that generate excessive traffic noise or require commercial vehicles or signage. I'm providing internet service, which requires none of those things. I had this approved by the previous board 3 years ago. "Well, "We're the new board and we're reviewing all previous approvals," Brenda said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "We've decided that your operation constitutes a business and needs to be regulated. First, we'll need your Wi-Fi password." I blinked at her. "Excuse me." "The HOA needs administrative access to the network," she continued, as if this made perfect sense. "Since it's serving the community, we need to be able to monitor it and ensure it's being used appropriately." "That's not how any of this works," I said, trying to keep my voice level. "First, I'm not running a Wi-Fi network that serves everyone. Each house has its own router connected to my main network via Ethernet cables I ran underground. Everyone has their own private network with their own passwords. Second, what you're asking for would give you access to monitor all internet traffic for 40 households, which is a massive invasion of privacy. And third, you have no legal right to demand this." Gerald leaned forward. "The HOA has a right to oversee any operations that affect the community." "I'm providing a service that people are choosing to pay for," I said. "If you want to start your own internet service and compete with me, go ahead, but you don't get to demand access to my network infrastructure." Brenda's face was turning red. "We're not asking, Mr. Daniels. We're telling you. Either you provide us with full administrative access to your network by the end of the week, or we'll fine you for running an unauthorized business." "You can't fine me for something that isn't against the rules," I said, standing up. "And even if you try, I'll fight it." "Is there anything else? You're making a big mistake," Brenda said, her voice low and threatening. "The HOA always wins, Mr. Daniels, always." I walked out without responding, my heart pounding with anger. I'd dealt with difficult people before, but there was something about Brenda's entitled attitude that really got under my skin. Over the next few days, I did some research into the new HOA board. It turned out that Brenda, Gerald, and Susan had moved into the community within the last 6 months. They'd run for the board positions when the previous members stepped down, and since nobody else wanted the job, they'd won by default. From what I could gather talking to neighbors, they'd already started making changes that people weren't happy about. They'd raised the HOA fees by 30%, implemented new rules about what colors you could paint your house, and started issuing fines for violations that seemed to be made up on the spot. On Friday, I received a certified letter from the HOA. Inside was a notice that I was being fined $500 for operating an unauthorized business, along with an additional $100 per day, until I provided them with the requested network access. The letter cited the same section of the bylaws I'd already debunked, along with some creative interpretations of other rules that had nothing to do with internet service. I scanned the letter and emailed it to my lawyer, a guy named Tom who'd helped me with the original approval 3 years ago. He called me back within an hour. "This is complete nonsense," Tom said. "They have no legal basis for any of this. I'll send them a cease and desist letter, but Yuri, you should know that fighting an HOA can be expensive and time-consuming, even when you're right." "I know," I sighed. "But I can't just let them push me around. And I'm not giving them access to everyone's private internet data. That's not just wrong, it could be illegal." "Agreed. Let me handle this. In the meantime, don't pay the fine and don't respond to any more of their demands without running it by me first." The cease and desist letter went out the following Monday. By Wednesday, I had another letter from the HOA, this time threatening to put a lien on my property if I didn't pay the accumulated fines, which they claimed now totaled $1,200. That evening, I sent an email to all my internet customers explaining the situation. I didn't want to drag them into it, but I felt they had a right to know what was happening. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within an hour, my phone was ringing off the hook with neighbors expressing their support and outrage at the HOA's behavior. One of those calls came from Alina Foster, a retired teacher who lived 3 houses down from me. Alina was in her 70s, sharp as a tack, and didn't suffer fools gladly. "Yuri, this is ridiculous," she said. "Brenda came by my house today demanding to know why I hadn't supported the HOA's position on your internet service. I told her exactly where she could stick her position." I couldn't help but laugh. "I appreciate the support, Alina. More than that, I've been doing some digging," she continued. "Did you know that Brenda's husband owns a telecommunications consulting company? I think this might be about more than just control. I think she's trying to shut you down so she can set up her own service and charge us all an arm and a leg." That was an angle I hadn't considered. "Do you have any proof?" "Not yet, but I'm working on it." In the meantime, several of us are planning to attend the next HOA meeting and give them a piece of our minds. The HOA meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday evening at 7. I cleared my calendar and showed up at 6:45 to find the community center already packed. It seemed like half the neighborhood had turned out, and from the angry conversations I was overhearing, most of them were not happy with the board. Brenda looked surprised and distinctly uncomfortable when she walked in at 7 and saw the crowd. She, Gerald, and Susan took their seats at the front table, and Brenda banged a gavel to call the meeting to order. "Good evening, everyone," she said, her voice strained. "This is quite a turnout. Before we begin, I want to remind everyone that there's a proper procedure for public comment, and we'll get to that after we've addressed the board's business. We want to talk about Yuri's internet service," someone shouted from the back. "And we will," Brenda said tersely, "after we've gone through the agenda." For the next 45 minutes, Brenda droned on about mundane HOA business, clearly trying to bore people into leaving. But the crowd remained, growing more restless by the minute. Finally, she reached the end of the agenda. "Now, we'll open the floor for public comment. Please remember to keep your remarks brief and respectful." Alina was the first one to stand. "I'd like to know what gives this board the right to demand access to private internet networks." "We're not demanding access to private networks," Brenda said smoothly. "We're simply requiring oversight of a business operation that's being run within the community." "That's a lie," someone else called out. "Yuri showed me the letter. You specifically demanded his Wi-Fi password." "Actually, I demanded administrative access to the network infrastructure," Brenda corrected, as if that made it better. "Since the service affects the entire community, the HOA has a responsibility to ensure it's being managed properly." "The service has been running perfectly for 3 years," Alina shot back. "We all have faster internet at a fraction of the cost we were paying before. The only problem here is this board's obsession with controlling everything." The crowd erupted in applause and shouts of agreement. Brenda banged her gavel repeatedly, her face flushed. "Order! Order! This kind of disrespect will not be tolerated. If you can't conduct yourselves appropriately, we'll clear the room." "You don't have the authority to do that," said a man I recognized as Robert Chen, a retired attorney who lived at the end of my street. "This is a community meeting, and under Nevada HOA law, residents have a right to be heard. Now, I've reviewed the bylaws and the letters you've sent to Mr. Daniels, and in my professional opinion, your actions are not only inappropriate but potentially illegal." Gerald stood up, his comb-over flopping to one side. "Are you threatening the board?" "I'm stating facts," Robert replied calmly. "You've issued fines without proper legal basis, you've demanded access to private data, and you've threatened to place liens on property for violations that don't exist. Any one of those actions could open the HOA up to a lawsuit. We're following the bylaws, Susan interjected, speaking for the first time. Then show us where in the bylaws it says you can do any of this, Robert challenged. Brenda shuffled through some papers, clearly flustered. It's all perfectly legal. We've consulted with our attorney. Then I'd like to know who your attorney is, Robert said. Because any competent lawyer would tell you that what you're doing is opening the association up to significant liability. The meeting devolved from there, with more and more residents standing up to express their frustration with the board. Brenda finally adjourned the meeting early, claiming they needed to reconvene in executive session, and she, Gerald, and Susan practically ran out of the room. I was gathering my things when a leaner approached me, her eyes twinkling with mischief. "I found out something interesting," she said quietly. "Brenda's husband's company, Patterson Telecommunications, submitted a proposal to the HOA last month to provide internet service to the community. The proposal was for $250 per month per household." "You're kidding," I said, though I wasn't really surprised. "Not at all. I have a friend who works at the county clerk's office, and she pulled the incorporation documents for me. Marcus Patterson is listed as the CEO, and Brenda is listed as a board member and part owner. This whole thing is about eliminating you as competition so they can force everyone to use their service." "That's a massive conflict of interest," I said. She should have recused herself from any votes involving internet service. "Should have, yes, did she? I doubt it. I'm going to do more digging, but I thought you should know what we're dealing with. Over the weekend, I received yet another letter from the HOA. This time, they were demanding that I cease providing internet service within 30 days or face legal action. They also informed me that my accumulated fines now totaled $3,000, and they would be proceeding with a lien on my property. I forwarded everything to Tom, who called me back sounding angrier than I'd ever heard him. "This is harassment, plain and simple," he said. "I'm going to file a motion for an injunction to stop them from placing a lien on your property, and I'm also going to recommend that you file a complaint with the Nevada Real Estate Division. What they're doing violates several HOA regulations." "How long will all this take?" I asked. "Could be months, unfortunately. The legal system moves slowly." After I hung up, I sat at my desk thinking about the situation. I'd built this network as a way to help my neighbors and solve a problem. Now it had turned into a legal nightmare, and it was costing me money and stress that I didn't need. Brenda and her cronies were clearly willing to abuse their power to get what they wanted, and even though I was confident I'd win eventually, the process was going to be expensive and exhausting. That's when the idea hit me. Brenda wanted control of the internet service. Fine. Let's see how she liked it when there was no internet service to control. I spent the rest of the weekend drafting a letter to all my customers. In it, I explained the situation in detail, including the information a leaner had uncovered about Brenda's financial interest in shutting me down. I then informed them that, effective in 30 days, I would be discontinuing the internet service. I was careful to explain that this wasn't retaliation, but rather a practical decision. The HOA had made it clear they considered my service to be an unauthorized business operation, and I wasn't willing to continue operating under threat of fines and legal action. I also included information about the only other internet provider in the area, along with their pricing, so nobody could say I'd left them in the lurch without alternatives. On Monday morning, I printed 40 copies of the letter and hand-delivered them to every house in the community. By Monday afternoon, my phone was ringing off the hook, but this time the calls weren't supportive. They were panicked. "Yuri, you can't shut down the internet," one neighbor said. "My whole business runs online. I'll be ruined." "I have kids doing online school," another said. "What are we supposed to do?" I sympathized with all of them, but I stood firm. "I'm sorry, but the HOA has made it impossible for me to continue. They're threatening to take my house over this. I can't keep fighting them." "Then we'll fight them," several people said. "I appreciate that, but it's not your fight. I've given 30 days notice. That should be enough time for everyone to make other arrangements." By Tuesday morning, Brenda's phone must have been ringing just as much as mine had been. I know this because she showed up at my door at 8 in the morning, Gerald in tow, both of them looking considerably less confident than they had before. "Mr. Daniels, we need to talk," Brenda said. "I'm listening," I replied, not inviting them in. "This notice you sent out about discontinuing service is causing quite an uproar in the community," Gerald said. "I imagine it is," I agreed. "But the HOA has made it clear that my service is an unauthorized business operation, and I'm facing thousands of dollars in fines." "I'm simply complying with your demands." "We never demanded you shut down the service," Brenda said, though her voice lacked its usual certainty. "No, you demanded administrative access to my network and threatened me with fines and liens when I refused. I've decided the easiest solution is to just shut it down entirely. That way there's no unauthorized business operation for you to worry about." "But what about the community?" Gerald asked. "People rely on this service." "They can use the other provider," I said. "It's more expensive, but it's available. Or perhaps the HOA could arrange for an alternative. I heard there was a proposal submitted by Patterson Telecommunications. Maybe you should pursue that." Brenda's face went white. "How did you know about that?" "It's not a secret," I said. "Public record, actually. Though I do find it interesting that you failed to disclose your financial interest in competing internet services when you started this whole crusade against me. That seems like a pretty serious conflict of interest." "I don't know what you're implying," Brenda said stiffly. "I'm not implying anything. I'm stating facts. Your husband owns a telecommunications company that wants to provide internet to this community at 5 times what I charge. You used your position on the HOA board to try to shut down the competition. When I refused to comply with your illegal demands, you threatened me with fines and liens. Now I'm shutting down my service, and suddenly you're concerned about the community. It's all very transparent, Brenda." "You can't prove any of that," Gerald said, but he didn't sound convinced. "Actually, I can. I have copies of all your letters, recordings of our conversations, and documentation of the proposal your company submitted. I've already shared all of it with my attorney and filed a complaint with the Nevada Real Estate Division. But none of that matters now because I'm done. The service ends in 28 days. I closed the door on their shocked faces and went back to my coffee. The next 2 weeks were chaotic. An emergency HOA meeting was called, and Brenda, Gerald, and Susan found themselves facing a room full of furious residents. Robert Chen stood up and formally moved for a vote of no confidence in the board. The motion passed almost unanimously, with only 3 votes against it from people who apparently hadn't been paying attention. However, removing a sitting HOA board wasn't as simple as voting them out. According to the bylaws, a recall election had to be scheduled, which required proper notice and procedures. In the meantime, the board remained in power, though they'd been effectively neutered by the community's anger. Brenda tried to save face by announcing that the HOA would be withdrawing all fines against me and apologizing for any misunderstanding. I declined to reinstate the internet service. The 30-day notice stood. "But we've resolved the issue." Brenda pleaded at another hastily called meeting. There's no reason to shut down the service now. The reason is trust, I said. You've spent the last month harassing me, threatening me, and trying to abuse your power to shut down a service that everyone loved. You only backed down when you realized the community was going to revolt. What's to stop you from doing this all over again in a few months? We won't, Susan said. You have our word. Your word means nothing to me, I replied bluntly. I'm done. The meeting ended with Brenda in tears and half the community glaring at the board with open hostility. Eleanor caught up with me in the parking lot. You know, you're really putting the screws to them, she said with obvious approval. They brought this on themselves, I said. Besides, I meant what I said about trust. Even if they recalled the whole board tomorrow, what's to stop the next group from pulling the same stunt? I've realized that running this service makes me vulnerable to this kind of abuse, and I'm not willing to put up with it anymore. I understand, Eleanor said. But you should know that several of us have been talking. We want to find a solution that works for everyone. Would you be willing to meet with us? I agreed, and that weekend I sat down with Eleanor, Robert Chen, and about a dozen other neighbors in Eleanor's living room. They'd clearly put some thought into this. Here's what we're proposing, Robert said. Instead of you running the internet service as an individual, we create a homeowner utility cooperative. It would be a separate legal entity from the HOA, governed by its own elected board, and you would be hired as the technical manager with a proper contract that protects you from this kind of harassment. The cooperative would own the infrastructure, Eleanor added. You'd still run it, but you wouldn't be personally exposed to liability, and the HOA would have no authority over it whatsoever. I had to admit, it was an interesting idea. How would the finances work? Everyone who wants service would buy a share in the cooperative for a one-time fee of, say, $200, Robert explained. That would give us working capital. Then we'd continue paying the same $50 a month for service. You'd be paid a salary for managing the network, and any profits would go into a reserve fund for equipment upgrades and maintenance. And the HOA can't touch any of it. Not a thing, Robert confirmed. Utility cooperatives are specifically protected under Nevada law. As long as we file the proper paperwork and maintain separate finances, the HOA has no more authority over us than they do over the power company. Over the next week, Robert drafted the articles of incorporation for the Sunset Ridge Internet Cooperative. We held a meeting to present the idea to the community, and 35 of the 40 households signed up immediately. The remaining 5 either didn't use much internet or decided to switch to the other provider out of spite. The formation of the cooperative seemed to break something in Brenda. At the next HOA meeting, she announced that she was resigning from the board, effective immediately. Gerald and Susan followed suit. Apparently, the Nevada Real Estate Division had launched an investigation into their conduct, and they'd been advised by their attorney that continuing to serve on the board would only make things worse for them. A new board was quickly elected, consisting of Eleanor, Robert, and a retired engineer named Patricia Gomez. Their first order of business was to formally recognize the Internet Cooperative as a legitimate community utility and rescind all fines and threats that had been issued against me. I wish I could say that was the end of the story, but there was one more twist. About 3 months after the dust had settled, I received a subpoena to appear at a hearing with the Nevada Real Estate Division. Tom accompanied me, and we found ourselves sitting across a conference table from an investigator named Janet Hughes, who had a thick file folder in front of her. "Mr. Daniels, thank you for coming in," Janet said. I want to go over the timeline of events regarding the Sunset Ridge HOA and your internet service. For the next hour, I walked her through everything that had happened, providing copies of all the letters, emails, and recordings I'd kept. Janet took detailed notes and asked pointed questions about specific interactions with Brenda, Gerald, and Susan. "This is very helpful," she said when we'd finished. "I want you to know that we take HOA abuse very seriously in Nevada. Based on what you've told me and the other evidence we've gathered, we believe the former board members violated several state regulations governing HOA conduct." "What happens now?" I asked. "That depends," Janet said. "In cases like this, we have the authority to impose fines and sanctions. In more serious cases, we can refer matters to the district attorney for criminal prosecution." "Criminal prosecution," Tom said, sitting up straighter. "For what?" Janet flipped open the file folder. "We've uncovered evidence that Brenda Patterson used her position on the HOA board to attempt to eliminate a competitor to her husband's business. That's not just a conflict of interest. Under Nevada law, it could constitute fraud and abuse of authority. Additionally, the fines and liens they threatened against Mr. Daniels were issued without proper legal basis, which could be considered extortion." I felt my jaw drop. I never thought it would go that far. "It might not," Janet cautioned. "That's up to the district attorney to decide. But I wanted you to be aware that this is being taken very seriously." 2 months later, I received a call from a deputy district attorney named Michael Rodriguez. He informed me that the state was pursuing criminal charges against Brenda Patterson for fraud and abuse of authority. Gerald and Susan were being offered plea deals in exchange for their testimony against Brenda, as they'd apparently been largely following her lead rather than acting independently. "We'd like you to testify at trial if it comes to that," Michael said. "Your documentation and testimony would be key to establishing the timeline and intent." I agreed, though I wasn't thrilled about the prospect of spending days in a courtroom. As it turned out, I didn't have to. When Brenda's attorney saw the evidence the state had compiled, including testimony from Gerald and Susan, financial records showing her ownership stake in Patterson Telecommunications, and copies of all the threatening letters she'd sent me, he advised her to take a plea deal. The hearing took place on a Tuesday morning in October, almost 8 months after this whole mess had started. I sat in the courtroom gallery with Alina and Robert as Brenda stood before the judge. She looked nothing like the confident, aggressive woman who'd first knocked on my door demanding my Wi-Fi password. She was pale, trembling, and could barely speak above a whisper as she entered her guilty plea to 1 count of abuse of authority and 1 count of fraud. The judge was not sympathetic. "Mrs. Patterson, you were elected to a position of trust within your community," he said, his voice hard. "Rather than serving the interests of your neighbors, you attempted to use that position to enrich yourself and your husband at their expense. You issued fraudulent fines, made illegal demands for access to private data, and threatened a homeowner's property rights. This kind of behavior undermines the entire concept of community governance and will not be tolerated." Brenda was sentenced to 6 months in jail, suspended pending 2 years of probation, 200 hours of community service, and ordered to pay restitution to me for my legal fees, which totaled nearly $15,000. She was also permanently barred from serving on any HOA board in Nevada. Her husband's company folded 3 months later, unable to overcome the publicity from the case. As I walked out of the courthouse that day, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders that I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying. Alina linked her arm through mine as we walked to the parking lot. "Well," she said, "that was quite a saga." "That's one way to put it," I agreed, Was it worth it? She asked. All the stress and fighting and legal fees. I thought about it for a moment. You know what? Yeah, it was. Not because I wanted revenge or anything like that, but because people like Brenda need to understand that they can't just push people around and abuse their power without consequences. If I'd just rolled over and given her what she wanted, she would have done the same thing to someone else eventually. Well said, Robert chimed in from behind us. And for what it's worth, the cooperative is working beautifully. We've actually expanded service to the neighboring community, and we're looking at bringing in another network engineer to help you manage it. That was true. The Sunset Ridge Internet Cooperative had become something of a model for other communities dealing with similar internet access issues. We'd been featured in several local news articles, and I'd received calls from people all over Nevada asking for advice on setting up similar systems. Life eventually returned to normal, or at least as normal as it gets. The internet service continued to run smoothly under the cooperative structure. The new HOA board, led by a leaner, focused on actual community improvements rather than power trips. I even got a small raise from the cooperative board for all the extra work I'd put in during the crisis. As for Brenda, I saw her once more about a year after the court hearing. I was coming out of a grocery store in Henderson when I spotted her loading bags into her car. She saw me at the same moment, and for a second, I thought she might just pretend she hadn't. But then she walked over, her shoulders hunched and her expression weary. I suppose you're happy with how everything turned out, she said. I shook my head. No, not really. I never wanted any of this. I just wanted to provide internet service to my neighbors. I made a lot of mistakes, she said quietly. I let my husband convince me that we could make money off the community, and I abused my position to try to make it happen. I'm sorry for what I put you through. It wasn't much of an apology, but it seemed genuine. I appreciate you saying that. I hope things get better for you. She nodded and walked back to her car without another word. Looking back on the whole experience, I learned several important lessons. First, no good deed goes unpunished, as the saying goes. I'd started out just trying to help people get affordable internet, and it had nearly cost me my house. Second, there are people in this world who will abuse any amount of power they're given, no matter how small. HOA boards attract these kinds of people like moths to a flame. And third, sometimes the only way to deal with a bully is to stand your ground, even when it's expensive and exhausting. The Sunset Ridge Internet Cooperative is still running strong today, now serving over 80 households across 2 communities. We've upgraded to 2 gigabit service, kept our prices at $50 a month, and built a reserve fund that'll keep us running for years. I'm still the technical manager, but I've got help now, and the cooperative board handles all the administrative stuff. The HOA, under a leaner's leadership, has become what it's supposed to be, a reasonable organization that maintains common areas, organizes community events, and stays out of people's business unless there's a genuine issue. The bylaws were revised to include strict conflict of interest provisions and limitations on the board's authority to issue fines. And me. I'm still living in my house in Henderson, working remotely as a network engineer and providing internet to my neighbors. The only difference is that now I've got legal protections, community support, and a hell of a story to tell at parties. Every time I see one of those internet connection bars on my devices showing full strength, I think about that day Brenda showed up at my door demanding my Wi-Fi password. She wanted control, wanted to turn a community service into a profit center, wanted to push me around because she thought she could. Instead, she got a criminal record, and I got to prove that sometimes, just sometimes, the little guy wins. The community center now has a plaque on the wall commemorating the formation of the Sunset Ridge Internet Cooperative. It reads, "Dedicated to the principle that communities thrive when neighbors help neighbors, not when power corrupts the powerful." Alina insisted on adding that last part, and I have to admit, it's pretty appropriate. I still get thanked regularly by neighbors for not giving in, for fighting back, and for ultimately finding a solution that worked for everyone. Kids doing homework on fast internet, people working from home without connectivity issues, families streaming movies together. That's what it was always supposed to be about, not power, not control, not profit, just neighbors helping neighbors get online. And if some entitled HOA president couldn't understand that basic concept, well, that was her problem, not mine. I'd offered a fair service at a fair price, and when she tried to abuse her position to shut me down, I simply took my ball and went home. The panic that followed, the community uprising, the legal consequences, all of that was just the natural result of her own actions coming back to haunt her. Some people never learn that lesson. Brenda learned it the hard way in front of a judge, with her freedom hanging in the balance. I hope she's doing better now, genuinely. But I don't regret standing up to her, not for a second. In the end, the story of Karen from the HOA demanding my Wi-Fi password became a cautionary tale, both for would-be HOA tyrants and for people who think they can't fight back against institutional bullying. You can fight back. You should fight back. And sometimes, if you're lucky and persistent, you'll win. The internet service I provide is faster now, more reliable, and serves more people than ever before. The community is stronger for having gone through that trial by fire. And I sleep well at night knowing that I didn't just roll over when someone tried to push me around. That's worth more than any amount of money or convenience. That's self-respect, community solidarity, and justice, all rolled into one satisfying package. So if you're reading this and you're dealing with your own HOA nightmare, or any situation where someone's abusing their power to make your life difficult, remember my story. Document everything. Know your rights, stand your ground, and don't be afraid to let consequences fall where they may. Because sometimes, the best way to win is simply to stop playing their game. And if that means canceling the internet service you provide to the community, because the HOA president couldn't keep her hands off something that wasn't hers to control, well, that's just the price of doing business with entitled people who think rules don't apply to them. Brenda learned that lesson. I hope she remembers it.